In the days of ancient Israel, when wickedness cast long shadows across the Promised Land, King Ahab ascended to the throne of the northern kingdom. The son of Omri proved more corrupt than all who came before him, for he not only walked in the sins of Jeroboam, but took as his wife Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. Under their rule, the worship of Baal flourished while the altars of the Lord lay in ruins. It was in these dark times that the Lord raised up Elijah the Tishbite from the inhabitants of Gilead. His name meant, "My God is Yahweh," and he stood as a burning torch against the tide of idolatry that swept through the land. With feet planted firmly on the dusty soil of Samaria, Elijah stood before King Ahab and declared with unwavering voice, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." The heavens obeyed the prophet's declaration, sealing themselves like bronze above the land. The curse of drought fell heavy upon Israel, a divine judgment against their apostasy. At first the Lord directed Elijah to the brook Cherith, where ravens brought him bread and meat, and he drank from the flowing waters. But as the drought persisted, even this stream withered away under the merciless sun. Then came the word of the Lord to Elijah, speaking with the gentle power that had first called him to prophecy. "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you." The command seemed strange. Zarephath lay in the heart of Jezebel's homeland, where Baal worship had first taken root. Yet it was to this foreign soil that God directed his prophet's steps. Zarephath rose from the coastline like a city of dust and dreams, its walls weathered by salt winds from the great sea. Within those walls, hunger walked the streets like a familiar friend, as the drought knew no borders and respected no boundaries. The city's gates stood as silent witnesses to the daily parade of suffering, where the poor grew poorer and hope grew thin as the morning mist. Little did the inhabitants of Zarephath know that their city had been chosen as the stage for one of God's most intimate demonstrations of provision and power. As Elijah approached the city gates, his sandals coated with the dust of his journey, he carried with him not just the authority of God's prophet, but the seeds of a miracle that would sprout in the most unexpected place, the empty pantry of a widow at the end of her rope. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the path where soon a widow would meet a prophet and where scarcity would meet the abundant provision of the God of Israel. The stage was set for a divine appointment that would demonstrate how God's mercy extends far beyond the borders of Israel, reaching into the most hopeless of circumstances with transforming power. Welcome back, Soul Warriors. Thank you for joining me on the Bible Psychology, where we discover how God's Word speaks to our deepest psychological needs. If you're new here, join our family by hitting subscribe, and don't forget to ring that bell for fresh biblical wisdom every week. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the ancient city of Zarephath, its rays reflecting off the weathered stone walls that had witnessed countless seasons of plenty and want. But none quite like this. 3 years of drought had transformed the once bustling coastal town into a place of quiet desperation, where even the wealthy found their stores dwindling. Through the shimmering heat waves, a solitary figure approached the town gate. His garments were dusty from travel, his appearance marked by the austerity of one who had lived in the wilderness. This was Elijah, the prophet of the Most High God, who had declared the drought that now gripped the land. His sandals scraped against the parched earth as he walked, guided by a divine promise that seemed, to human eyes, impossible to fulfill. Near the town gate, a widow moved with the deliberate slowness of one conserving energy. Her thin fingers gathered sticks one by one, precious fuel for what she believed would be her final meal. The prophet's eyes were drawn to her, and in that moment he knew, with certainty, that this was the one of whom the Lord had spoken. "Please," Elijah called out, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to speaking God's words, yet gentle with the understanding of human suffering. "Would you bring me a little water in a jar, so I may have a drink?" The widow straightened slowly, her dark eyes studying the stranger. Despite her own dire circumstances, the ancient laws of hospitality still held power. She turned to fulfill his request, her feet stirring small clouds of dust with each step. But before she could move away, Elijah's voice reached her again. and please, bring me a piece of bread." At these words, the widow stopped. Her shoulders tensed, and when she turned back to face him, her voice trembled with the weight of unshed tears. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar, and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for my son that we may eat it and die." The stark honesty of her words hung in the air between them, but Elijah's face showed no surprise, only a deep certainty that seemed to pierce through the despair of the moment. His next words would change everything. "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son." Then he spoke words that would echo through centuries to come. "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The widow stood motionless, dust swirling around her feet as a warm breeze stirred through the gateway. In this moment she faced a choice that would define not just her fate, but her faith: to trust in what she could see, the meager remains of her provisions, or to believe in the impossible promise spoken by this strange prophet of a foreign god. The sun continued its relentless march across the sky, as prophet and widow stood at the crossroads of despair and hope, scarcity and abundance, death and life. The next moments would reveal whether faith could truly blossom in the barren soil of impossibility. The sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Zarephath as the widow's fingers trembled around her gathering basket. Her eyes met those of the strange prophet who had just asked her for water and bread. In her heart she felt the weight of her last handful of flour waiting in the jar at home, barely enough for one final meal with her son before they would embrace death's cold grip. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, her voice catching in her throat, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." But Elijah's words carried an impossible promise. "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The widow stood motionless, the gathered sticks pressing splinters into her palms. In her culture, hospitality was sacred, a divine duty passed down through generations. Yet never had it demanded such a price. This was not merely about sharing bread, it was about surrendering her last hope of survival. Time seemed to stop as thoughts raced through her mind. She had witnessed the devastating effects of the drought that had turned fertile fields into wastelands. She had seen neighbors and friends succumb to hunger. Each morning she had measured their dwindling supplies with increasing despair, watching her son grow thinner with each passing day. Yet there was something in the prophet's eyes, a certainty that spoke of powers beyond her understanding. This man, this servant of a foreign god, stood before her with a promise that defied all reason. What did she have to lose that she was not already about to lose? In that moment, her decision transcended mere survival instinct. It became an act of profound faith, not just in Elijah's words, but in the possibility that even in this foreign land, the God of Israel might extend his mercy to a Sidonian widow and her son. Her feet carried her home before her mind could object. Each step felt heavy with the weight of destiny. As she pushed open her door, the familiar sight of the nearly empty flour jar and oil jug seemed to mock her decision. Yet her hands moved with new purpose as she gathered the ingredients for bread. The widow's simple kitchen became holy ground as she mixed her last measure of flour with oil. The dough took shape beneath her fingers, perhaps the last food she would ever prepare, and she was giving it to a stranger. As she worked, a peculiar peace settled over her spirit. If these were to be her final actions, let them be actions of faith. In choosing to feed Elijah first, she was not merely offering hospitality, she was surrendering her very existence to a divine promise. Her decision echoed through the centuries, a testament to the raw courage required when God asks us to pour out our last resources in trust of His provision. As she shaped the small loaf for Elijah, her movements became a prayer, her kitchen an altar. In this simple act of making bread, she participated in a mystery far greater than herself. She could not have known that her story would be told for generations, that her decision would stand as a beacon of faith for countless others facing their own moments of desperate choice. The bread began to bake, filling her humble home with an aroma that seemed to her like incense rising to heaven. She had chosen to believe. Now all that remained was to witness what her faith would bring. In the humble dwelling of the widow of Zarephath, where shadows of hunger once loomed, a remarkable transformation unfolded day by day. Each morning, as dawn's first light crept through the windows, the widow would approach her flour jar and oil jug with trembling hands. Yet every time, without fail, she found them mysteriously replenished, containing just enough for another day's sustenance. The clay jar that had once echoed empty now held promises fulfilled. As her weathered hands dipped the measuring cup into the flour, she marveled at how it never grew less. The oil, golden and precious, flowed like heaven's tears into her cooking vessels. Each handful of flour, each drop of oil bore testimony to God's unfailing word through His prophet Elijah. In those days the streets of Zarephath lay silent under the scorching sun. The drought had turned the land harsh and unforgiving. Yet within the widow's home, 3 unlikely companions, a foreign prophet, a Sidonian widow, and her young son, shared daily bread that tasted of divine grace. Their meals were simple, but each morsel carried the weight of miracle. While other households in Zarephath shuttered their windows against the famine's grip, smoke rose steadily from the widow's chimney. The aroma of freshly baked bread drifted through the air, a testament to God's provision. Neighbors whispered among themselves, wondering how this poor widow, once preparing for her last meal, now had food each day. The miracle extended beyond mere survival. As a Sidonian woman, the widow had grown up worshiping Baal, yet here was Yahweh, the God of Israel, sustaining her household day after day. Each morning brought new evidence of His power, each evening closed with grateful hearts. The flour jar and oil jug became her daily altar, where faith was tested and proven true with every meal prepared. In the quiet moments between bread making, she often stood before her provisions, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. This was more than food. It was a daily reminder that the God of Elijah saw her, knew her needs, and cared for her despite her foreign status. The same hands that commanded ravens to feed Elijah now provided for a Gentile widow and her son. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, yet the promise remained unbroken. The flour did not cease, the oil did not run dry. In a time when the mighty King Ahab's granaries grew empty, this widow's simple jar remained full. It defied nature, challenged logic, and testified to a power greater than any earthly authority. Through this daily miracle, the widow learned that faith was not a single moment of belief, but a continuous journey of trust. Each time she reached into the jar, she remembered Elijah's words and the leap of faith she had taken when she used her last handful of flour to feed him. Now that same faith was being rewarded 100-fold. As evening shadows lengthened across their small home, the 3 would gather around their humble table. The bread they shared was more than sustenance. It was tangible proof of God's faithfulness, a daily reminder that He provides not just for His chosen people, but for all who put their trust in Him. In the midst of widespread famine, their table became an oasis of hope, their story a testament to the God who makes impossible promises possible. Enjoying these divine revelations? Hit subscribe and the bell icon to never miss our weekly insights. Your spiritual journey matters to us. Now let's continue exploring. The morning sun had barely touched the widow's humble dwelling in Zarephath when tragedy cast its shadow over the household. The boy who had been full of life, who had watched in wonder as flour and oil sustained them through the drought, now lay still upon his bed. His breath, once warm and steady, had ceased altogether. In his mother's arms his body grew cold despite the heat of the day. The widow's wails echoed through the small home, her voice thick with anguish and accusation. "What do you have against me, O man of God?" she cried out to Elijah, her words sharp with grief. "Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Her fingers clutched at her child's lifeless form, memories of their shared meals and laughter now turning to bitter ash in her mouth. The miracle of endless flour and oil seemed a cruel joke in the face of this loss. Elijah, the man who had brought God's promise of provision to her home, stood in the doorway, his heart heavy with the weight of her pain. He stepped forward. "Give me your son," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. The widow, tears streaming down her weathered face, released her grip on the boy's body. Elijah took the child in his arms, feeling the dead weight that had replaced the buoyant energy he had known. Up the stairs he went, to his upper room where he had spent many hours in prayer. There he laid the boy on his own bed, his mind wrestling with the mystery of God's purposes. 3 times he stretched himself over the child's body, his prayer rising with increasing urgency. "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." The room grew thick with the presence of the divine as Elijah continued his passionate intercession. "Lord," he cried out, "this widow has opened her home to me, shared her last meal at your command. She has witnessed your daily provision. Let not her faith end in tragedy. Show her that you are not only the God who provides flour and oil, but the God who gives life itself." The moments stretched like years until suddenly, beneath Elijah's hands, warmth began to return to the child's body. A flutter, faint at first, then stronger. The boy's chest began to rise and fall. His eyelids trembled, then opened. Color flooded back into his cheeks as his lungs filled with air, and a cry escaped his lips, the sound of life restored. Elijah's heart soared with gratitude and awe. He gathered the boy in his arms, his own eyes now wet with tears of joy. Down the stairs he went, each step purposeful, carrying not just a child, but a testament to God's power over death itself. "Look," he said to the widow, presenting her son, alive and whole. "Your son lives." The widow's hands shook as she reached for her child, drawing him close to her breast. Through her tears, a new light dawned in her eyes, the light of unshakable faith. "Now I know," she declared, her voice strong and clear, "that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." In that moment, in that humble home in Zarephath, death's power had been broken. The God who had sustained them with endless flour and oil had now revealed an even greater truth. He was the God not just of daily bread, but of life itself. The widow's faith, tested by tragedy, emerged stronger than ever, forged in the furnace of grief and restored by the power of resurrection. The still chamber hung heavy with the weight of death. Elijah lay prostrate across the boy's lifeless form, his third prayer rising with desperate intensity. "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." His words echoed against the stone walls, and in that moment something shifted in the air. The boy's chest suddenly heaved with life, his skin, once cold and pale, flushed with warmth. His eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition as he drew in deep, gasping breaths. Elijah's heart leaped within him as he witnessed the power of God manifest before his very eyes. Taking the child in his arms, Elijah descended the stairs from the upper room, each step measured and deliberate. The widow paced below, her face etched with grief's deepest lines. When she heard their footsteps, she turned, and time itself seemed to stop. "Look," Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion, "your son lives." The widow's legs buckled beneath her as she rushed forward, gathering her son into her arms. Tears streamed down her face. These were different from the bitter drops of mourning she had shed before. These were tears of joy, of wonder, of a faith being born anew. "Now I know," she declared, her voice ringing with certainty where doubt had once dwelt, "that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." Her proclamation was not merely words, it was a testimony carved from the crucible of her experience, the flour that never emptied, the oil that never ran dry, and now, most miraculously, her son restored to life. Word of the miracle spread through Zarephath like wildfire. The Phoenician town, which had once viewed the Hebrew prophet with suspicion, now buzzed with accounts of the extraordinary events that had unfolded in the widow's home. People who had been skeptical of Elijah's God began to question their assumptions. If Yahweh could sustain life through an endless supply of flour and oil, if he could even reverse death itself, what manner? The impact rippled through the community. Neighbors who had watched the widow's plight now witnessed her transformation. The woman who had once prepared to die with her son now stood as a living testament to God's power. Her home, once a place of impending death, became a beacon of hope in the drought-stricken land. For Elijah, this miracle served as divine validation of his ministry, but it was more than that. It was a powerful demonstration that God's concern extended beyond the borders of Israel, reaching even to a Phoenician widow in Zarephath. The God who had sent him to this foreign land had proven himself faithful not just in providing daily bread, but in providing life itself. As days passed, the story of the widow's son became a symbol of hope throughout the region. In a time when Baal worship dominated the land, here was undeniable evidence of a God who not only sustained life, but could restore it. The widow and her son stood as living proof that the God of Israel was not bound by national borders, that his mercy could reach anyone who would trust in him, and that his power over death itself was absolute. And so, in this small town of Zarephath, through the faith of a widow and the prayer of a prophet, God had planted a seed of truth that would continue to bear witness to his power long after Elijah departed. The restoration of the widow's son became more than a miracle. It became a testament to the far-reaching love of a God who could turn mourning into dancing and death into life. As the sun set over Zarephath, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, the widow stood in her doorway. Her son, now full of life, played in the courtyard, while she gazed at the jar of flour and cruse of oil that had sustained them through the long drought. These simple vessels held more than just sustenance. They contained the very essence of God's faithful promise. In her heart, she recalled those desperate moments when she had first met Elijah. She had been ready to prepare a final meal for herself and her son, accepting what she believed would be their last moments together. Yet here she stood, months later, witnessing not only God's daily provision, but also the miracle of her son's resurrection. Her journey from desperation to faith had transformed her understanding of divine providence. The lessons learned in her humble home echoed through the ages, speaking to all who would listen. Faith, she discovered, wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about taking that first step when all seemed lost. Like the flour that never ran out, God's faithfulness proved inexhaustible. Her story whispered hope to the downhearted, courage to the fearful, and strength to those facing impossible choices. For those who hear her tale today, her experience poses a gentle yet profound question. What empty vessels in your life await God's filling? Perhaps you stand where she once stood, gathering sticks for what feels like your last meal. Or maybe you face choices that require stepping into the unknown, trusting in promises that seem too good to be true. The widow of Zarephath's story reminds us that our moments of deepest scarcity often become the stage for God's most extraordinary provision. Her testimony challenges us to examine our own response when divine directions seem to defy human logic. Will we, like her, dare to pour out what little we have, trusting that God's promises will not run dry? As night falls on this ancient tale, it invites each of us to consider, what would our lives look like if we embraced such radical trust? What miracles await in our own vessels of scarcity? The widow's legacy beckons us to discover that sometimes the smallest act of obedience opens the door to God's most magnificent demonstrations of faithfulness. Her story doesn't end with the miracle of provision or even with her son's resurrection. It continues in the lives of all who choose to walk the path of faith, who dare to believe that the God who kept his promise to a widow in Zarephath still keeps his promises today. For in every age, in every circumstance, he remains the God who sees, the God who provides, and the God who calls us to trust him with all that we have and all that we are. Thank you for sharing in this divine wisdom today. If you haven't already, join our growing family by subscribing to the Bible Psychology. Click that bell icon, because every week we uncover more life-changing biblical truths together. Share this video with someone who needs this message, and I'll meet you in our next spiritual discovery. Shalom, beloved viewers.